So I've entitled this presentation Dolmens Around the World, and indeed we are going to look at dolmens all around the world. However, I'm sure you probably realize that it's going to be a fairly shallow overview. I mean, there's tens of thousands of dolmens around the world, so we're not going to look at anywhere near any fraction of that today. But we will do our best to do justice to the different sorts of dolmens that we know about. So what is a dolmen anyway? So technically, a dolmen is a type of single chamber megalithic tomb, usually consisting of two or more vertical megaliths supporting a large flat horizontal capstone or table. Most of these date from the late Neolithic, that could be 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, or the Bronze Age, 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. And those dates are obviously very approximate. Sometimes they're actually covered with earth or smaller stones to form a tumulus or mound over top of the dolmen, and then that later eroded away in some cases. The oldest dolmen that we know about was dated to 7,000 years ago, and it's found in Western Europe. So what I've been describing is what we call a true dolmen. But they are also called quoits, cromlechs, megalithic tombs. In Portuguese, they're called antas, and in Korean, they're called goindol. Here is a classic example. This is called the Lanyon Quoit in Cornwall. You can see the beautiful flat capstone and the very narrow plate-like uprights holding it up. In this case, I think there's 4 of them. In some cases, there could be 3 or more than 4. Here's another very classic example where the capstone is really quite flat, and so are the uprights, very thin. This one is Poolnabron Dolmen in Ireland. Now this one is from Korea. Korea has a lot of dolmens, and we will in fact talk a lot about Korean dolmens later on. But you can see it is quite similar to the ones that we were already looking at in Ireland and Cornwall. So these are all very classic dolmen shapes. This one is from Portugal, and it is huge. It's a little bit different. It has some of the same characteristics of capstones and uprights. It also has a bit of a chamber on the back of it, though. So sort of a combination dolmen and chamber. But the stones here are absolutely massive. Like those ones in the foreground would be over my head if I was standing in the picture. And I am standing in the picture of this one. This one is also from Portugal, although not very close to the other one, quite far away. And Portugal is just loaded with dolmens. I had a lovely time driving around Portugal with my wife Elizabeth a few years ago, trying to track down as many of these as I could. So the styles do vary, though. I've been showing you examples of maybe the most classic, cleanest style, but they do vary quite a bit. Well, that's Europe and Korea and other places like that. But what about in the Americas? Well, in 1976, Barry Fell published America, BC. And in there, he suggested that dolmens could also be found in the Americas. Now, that was something new because no one had ever suggested that before. He identified boulders perched on smaller stones, we call that pedestals, as the American equivalent of Old World dolmens. Now, this was and is very controversial because geologists had already found a natural explanation for the pedestalled boulders. So he was suggesting that the geological explanation was insufficient and that they really did represent some kind of human monument. And his prototype, I think, and it's already been discussed here today, is the Balanced Rock in North Salem, New York. So it's a beautiful example of a perched boulder or a pedestal boulder. When you look underneath, it's really quite interesting, because I think Mary Ellen also mentioned the fact that the pedestal stones can be actually changed in shape by the weight of the boulder above. And in fact, that's what's going on here. Those pedestals are wearing away partly due to the weight of the stone above. And so they're changing shape as time goes on, because the pressure is flaking off parts of the stone. And so it's actually slowly disintegrating, but at the moment, that's what it looks like. Another very classic example of what we now sometimes call dolmens in NEARA is Tripod Rock, which is on Pyramid Mountain in New Jersey. So although these pedestal boulders of the New World do look similar to some Old World dolmens, it really isn't correct to call them dolmens. That's really something different. A pedestal boulder is truly a more accurate term. Sometimes people will say perched boulder as well, but that even means something slightly different. I mean, they are perched boulders, but perched boulders don't even need to have any pedestals. Just a regular boulder sitting at the top of a cliff is also a perched boulder. Sometimes people use the expression glacial erratic, but that's not a very good term either, because it doesn't really mean what most people think it means. A glacial erratic just means that the geological type of the boulder deposited by the glacier is different than the geological type of the bedrock in that area. So it doesn't have to be perched, it doesn't have to be pedestaled, it doesn't even have to be big. Just any old rock that's a different geological type, like sandstone, versus the bedrock of the area, which might be granite. That is technically a glacial erratic. So it doesn't, you're not really saying much. And a lot of times people say something's a glacial erratic when it isn't even that at all. I mean, if it's the same geology as the bedrock, then it's definitely not erratic. It might be a glacial boulder, but it's not erratic unless its geology is different from the bedrock. So we shouldn't use these, I don't think, as synonyms for pedestal boulder. That's really the proper terminology. Now, we've already seen a number of examples of pedestal boulders from the New England area today, and often we see them at NEARA talks, and that's great, love to see it. But maybe you'd like to see something different. So I will show you a few examples from Canada. Now, as I said, people do call these dolmens, and they do look similar to some true dolmens. Very fell popularized its usage, but I'm going to avoid using that terminology, and I think we really should avoid it. The first one I'm going to show you is called the Sibley Stone. This one is maybe the most famous. It's actually appeared in NEARA publications in the past, and if you can see my pointer, this is it over here. It's off in the distance, but I wanted to point out the fact that it's sitting on a bedrock table, if you will. This is solid bedrock. It's an outcrop, but it's been heavily worn away by the glaciers. And so then this boulder is sitting there, but it does have pedestal stones. This is a close-up of it. And you can see it's quite interesting. It's on one end, the pedestal stones are quite big, but towards the left side, one of the pedestal stones holding it up is quite small, but sort of upright as well. This is the same stone from another angle. So you can see now that it's actually only the three stones holding it up. So it is pretty impressive. Now, another one from the nearby area around Halifax is the Kidston Stone. This also has gotten a lot of press over the years because it is impressive. One of the things to notice about both the Sibley Stone and the Kidston Stone is that the pillars or the pedestals are reasonably similar to the type of stone that make up the upright. So if you look at the edges of these stones, like the sharpness of the edges, the state of smoothness of the different surfaces, they don't look all that different. In this case, they're all granite for one thing, and the wear surfaces are quite similar. So that's something to keep in mind as we go along. Now, this is another example from near Halifax as well. I should mention the first two that I just showed you are, although they're near the capital city, they're reasonably hard to find and fairly hard to get at. So you have to be a determined hiker to make the trek out to them. On the other hand, Eagle Rock is a perched boulder sitting on the edge of a very tall cliff, and it's well known in the community, has been for many, many years, and it's not that far from the road or the populated area. So it's a popular spot for people to go and hang out, and of course they can't resist leaving their graffiti on it. This is a close-up of one of the pedestals, and it's a little. This is a little different than the other two we looked at, in that the pedestals do seem to have different wear patterns than the main stone. The main stone also has a huge crack in it, which you can see here, and it seems like that crack is going to eventually go all the way through the rock. And so I think this one is on a fairly limited lifetime. It's on life support. For those of you who have ever come to Nova Scotia, you'll know that Peggy's Cove is a popular tourist destination, and there are glacial boulders all over the Peggy's Cove area. Many of them are supported by little stones underneath, like this one. Now, this is not Peggy's Cove. This is Polly Cove, which is actually the next cove down the coast from Peggy's Cove. But the geology is quite similar, and we could find dozens and dozens of examples from all that area. They're not hard to find. Now, as I mentioned, geologists have actually been able to explain these pedestal boulders. And a lot of people find that hard to believe. And when we tell them that, oh yeah, no, the glacier did that, they'll say, yeah, I don't believe that for a minute. Like, there's no way a glacier can do that. But in fact, there is a process that does explain it. So the thing is, when the ice melts, it does end up leaving big stones on top of little stones at times. Now, there's a couple of ways this can happen. One of them is the stones can melt directly out of the ice. And if there's small stones under the big ones, as the ice melts, then that's how they end up sitting on top of each other. But the second method can occur when the stones occur in the till. Now, till is like sort of a mud or a sandy dirt, clay mixture that contains boulders as well. And so if the till is deposited as a unit, but later on erosion washes away the finer sediments like the sand and the clay, then the stones can be left sort of as a skeleton of the till later on. So we'll look at some examples of that. First, let's talk about the glacier itself. So this is a map showing what the glacier, the North American glacier, probably looked like at its maximum. So we call that the last glacial maximum. And you can see all of Canada was under the Laurentide ice sheet. There was an area in Alaska that remained free of ice, and the lower parts of the US also remained free of ice. Now, as time went on, from there, the ice did begin to melt eventually. So this is just a little bit further in time. We're talking about 13,000 years ago now. And it's interesting to see the ice-free corridor is now being exposed. This was once thought to be the way that early man populated the Americas, but in recent years, we realized that it opened up much too late for that, because we've got archaeological sites that are at least 10,000 years older than 13,000, when the ice-free corridor finally did open up. But let's look at a slightly smaller scale. I've got a couple of maps of Atlantic Canada, and something similar was happening obviously in New England as well at this time. So here we're down to 13,000 years, and a lot of the land areas are coming out of their ice cover. So the creamy color is still where the glacier is persisting. The green colors is land, and then the blue is water, obviously. But you can see that out here, this is offshore Nova Scotia. And today, this is all water. In the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, today, it's all underwater, under about 100 meters of water. And Georges Bank, same thing, although Georges Bank is still pretty shallow. But in those days, it was dry land, 13,000 years ago. And as the glaciers continued to melt, what happened was the land rebounded. And or actually first the water came back into the ocean basin. So as the ice melted, and then the sea level rose because of the rise, the water, the meltwater refilling the ocean basin. So we ended up with less land. The land that was exposed became underwater again. Anyway, so the point is, the ice gradually disappeared and left behind an ancient coastline. Now, what about the dolmens, or the pedestalled boulders? How did they actually form? Well, one of the things that happens as the ice is melting is that it creates rivers in the glacier itself. And these rivers, even though they're in the ice, they still form riverbeds that have boulders, gravel, sand, and clay in them. Because all of that material was embedded in the ice, and it was scraped up by the glacier and incorporated into the body of the glacier. So the glacial till is the material left behind after the glacier melts. Now, if we look at a modern example of a glacier, we can go to places like Norway and Iceland and find glaciers today, and we can find places where there are, in fact, rivers flowing through them. So this is an example near the face of the glacier, where the river has kind of come out of the ice, and so the roof is exposed here, but you can see the walls that have formed from the water carrying away the melting ice. And now this is probably on solid bedrock, but the same thing can happen, in the body of the mass of the ice itself as the meltwater erodes river channels under ice. Now here's a picture of the side of a embankment where you can see what Glacial Till looks like. I think most of us, being from this part of the world, are quite familiar with it, but it's a nice illustration of how the boulders are embedded in the till. In this case, there's a section of till that is mostly sand and clay, and only a few boulders. But then at the lower part, there's a lot more boulders. So, and then there's also a differentiation here where there's more sand and gravel, and over here there's less sand and gravel. So these tills are differentiated. There's variation between them. This is an example of till that has a lot more stone in it. You can see how all the stones are fairly rounded. Maybe the odd one that has a sharp edge, but that would be quite exceptional. Like stones that are found in till have been tumbled and worn out. Their surfaces have been worn, just like in a stone tumbler. So their sides and their edges are usually fairly smooth. Another example of till, where you can see the sorting of the different types of till. Some of it has more gravel, some of it has more boulders. So here is a great photo that's actually from California, Big Pine, California, showing an example of what happens when the section of glacier ice starts melting and you have one of these big boulders in it. So what I was showing you before was pictures of boulder and till, but sometimes there's not much tilt. It's mostly ice. And what happens is that the boulder like this can form kind of a sunshade. So it allows the boulder to remain suspended on a pillar of ice. Now, this ice could also have a few stones in it. And as the ice melts, eventually the big capstone will settle down on perhaps a few smaller stones underneath. So this is an example where it's not coming out of the till, but it's just coming out of the raw ice. And it's not that unusual. I mean, it's a little bit unusual, but there's lots of examples of it. I think this one was from Norway. It's a drawing that was made, I believe, in the 1800s. This is another one. I think it's also from Norway. Similar idea. So as the ice melts, the top boulder can be let down somewhat gradually, although there may be a catastrophe when the ice fails at the end. And there are examples of this occurring. It's you can just imagine, you know, that a dolmen with a nice flat capstone ending up, or I should say a perch boulder, I'm catching myself, formed this way as the ice melts. Here's another kind of interesting example. I think these pillars that you see here probably did have capstones on them until fairly recently, when the capstone finally tumbled off because it was shading the pillar underneath it from melting any sooner. Another interesting example. And there you go. A couple more, all the same thing, but just to show you that plenty of examples can be found. Here's an interesting one, because this one is practically a perch boulder now. If we looked really carefully under there, I think we'd find like 3 or 4 smaller pedestal stones already supporting it. And sometimes you get even weirder things, like talking about perch boulders. These ones really don't have a pedestal. They're just supported by a peak in the bedrock. Really unusual. Here's one of the most unusual ones from Slovakia, where this is the same one looked at in 2 different angles, but you can see how amazing. So when people say, "Oh yeah, glaciers," they don't do that sort of thing. In fact, the glaciers will do that sort of thing. So it's quite amazing what glaciers can do as the ice melts, because it melts very gradually. Or in other cases, it could be violent outwash, you know, as a river changes course. And so there's a number of processes that take place. Here's an example from Washington State, where a fairly huge boulder is obviously coming out of the till. And the till is gradually being washed away. So if there's a few somewhat larger stones in here, eventually, you know, in another 100 years or so, this thing might be a beautiful example of a pedestal boulder. Okay, so here's another one from Atlantic Canada, where it's right on the coast. People kayaking by get a nice view of the pedestals down there. This is another one from Ontario. It's also on a waterway. So canoeists again can see that as they go by. This is also on a canoe route, as is this one, which is this one is actually close to the American border, in a place called the Boundary Lakes Canoe Zone, canoeing park. So the thing is, geology can explain these pedestal boulders, but we have to admit, as I think Mary Ellen Lepica did say, it's not necessarily always the case, because even though geology can explain it, we also know that people could build these things too. It's certainly within their abilities to construct them if they want to. And in fact, there are reasons why. We could talk about why they would do it. That could be a whole discussion on its own. we will touch on some of that as we go through, but yeah, there's certainly reasons to say that they would build them or at least modify them, even if it meant adding a new pedestal stone to the ones that were there already, or doing things like that. The problem is it's very hard as scientists or investigators, researchers, it's very hard for us to find diagnostic evidence that can clearly decide whether something is natural or if it has been manipulated by people. Now, there are a few things we can consider, but the fact is, like in this is a perfect case. Like it certainly could be natural. It certainly could be manipulated. It could be a combination. And there's every reason to think in this particular one that it would have been manipulated because it's right on a very well-known canoe route. And it could easily have been set up to let the people know that this was the place they should get out of their canoe and camp for the night. If you regularly use that canoe route, you'd want to have a way of unambiguously marking the spot for other people to know, that this is the gathering place to stop, and we'll all gather when we all get there. So what kind of evidence can we look for in terms of trying to decide if it looks manipulated or not? So as I mentioned earlier, natural pedestal boulders, usually you would expect the pedestals to have about the same amount of glacial erosion and glacial smoothing as the main stone. If the difference is really striking, then that is one mark in the column of probable manipulation. And another thing is if the pedestals themselves are very precarious, it's less likely that they were put there by the glacier, especially when there's shims involved, and it looks like it doesn't look like it survived for 10,000 years out in nature. It's probably, maybe it's only 500 years old. So that's another thing you can consider. And as I mentioned, and also Mary Ellen did as well, there's circumstantial evidence such that if you know that it was in a culturally significant place, or if there's a known history of Native American activity in the area, I mean, it's certainly not proof, but it makes you want to consider that it might not be as simple as a natural deposition. Also, if there's alignments, and this is something we've discussed frequently in NEARA, where you might have a pedestal boulder that lines up with an observation seat and also lines up with the solstice sunrise. None of these things on its own is a conclusive proof, but if you're ticking all the boxes, then you're starting to think, you know what, it's really leaning in that direction of being a manipulated pedestal boulder. If you're ticking none of the boxes, then chances are it is probably natural. So, but I don't think you can ever, it's rare that you're 100% positive of one or the other, although maybe sometimes you are. This is more of a humorous one. They're obviously not lifting, but they'd like to imagine that they are. If they had levers, it'd be a little more convincing. Here's another one from Ontario. The significance of this one is that it is also on it's right next to a very well-traveled canoe route as well. Okay, this one from Ontario is quite striking. I know some of you may have seen this. This is underwater. It's at a place that's been underwater for the last 8,000 years. It's in a place called MacDonald Lake, Ontario. And I could do a whole talk on this one alone. It's at a very culturally significant place for people 8,000 years ago, due to it being at the edge of a lake that saw salmon runs in the spring. and so on. It's also the reason why it's underwater is because there was a glacial dam that was holding up another lake somewhere else, and when the dam eventually broke, it ended up flooding this area. But so we can, that's how we can date this one, is because we know that it was built before that glacial dam broke. And this is looking at the pedestals of that one. There are shims. They don't come out too clearly in this photo, but the good photos do show the fact that there's a very carefully placed shim right here under this one. It seems very unlikely that those shims would be placed in exactly the configuration they're in if it was a natural deposit. The problem with this one, though, is, like I said, it's underwater, and it was discovered by submarine. It was actually a submarine operating the Haliburton Forest for a while until the Ontario government shut them down. They said they didn't have the right permits to operate the submarine. So as far as I know, no one has seen this in about 10 years or so since the submarine was put out of commission. Here's another one from New Jersey, and there is a famous tripod rock in New Jersey, which I did show earlier, but this is also called Tripod Rock in New Jersey, and I thank Matt Adams for supplying me with the photos. But I think it's a great example of shims, or shims, but also pedestals that seem unlikely to be of the same age as the capstone. Because you can see they don't look eroded at all. In fact, they look like they've been broken off fairly recently, in geological terms anyway. And it could have been like 800 years ago, but they don't look like they've been exposed to the same amount of weathering as the capstone. So I think the chances are pretty high that this one was put together or at least modified by human intervention. All right, so I'm advertising an around the world tour, and so far we haven't left North America, except for in the intro. What about pedestal boulders in Europe? I mean, people often say, well, there were glaciers in Europe. Why aren't we seeing these pedestal boulders if they're all natural? Why aren't we seeing any in Europe? But I think it's just lack of information, because in fact, there are some in Europe. They may not be as famous. For one thing, Europe has a lot of genuine dolmens, so the pedestal boulders that are natural are less of a novelty. You don't tend to give them much attention at all. But yeah, there are a few. I think this was the same one from two different views, because it's a really great example, but I don't think it's the only one. Now, this is quite a curious one. This is from Italy, from the Alps, and it's declared to be a typical Neolithic sacred site. And it may well be. I'm not sure how they determined that. If they found actual Neolithic artifacts in the soil, then there's no question. But I can also see this one as being natural too, because obviously this capstone really looks like it was originally connected over here on the left, and at some point just fell over. And these other uprights also look like they flaked off, or basically glacially plucked to some extent from the bedrock outcrop here too. So this one, it might well be a Neolithic sacred site, and it might also be completely natural. Really hard to tell, but it just goes to show, it's a very gray area at times. So there are different styles. Like in the intro, I showed you the real classic look of Old World dolmens, but some of them start to look more like the North American ones at times. So this is actually a dolmen from Ireland, and it's hard to tell that that was even manipulated at all. I mean, it's theoretically possible. It could be completely natural. But I mean, it obviously was used as a tomb. So chances are it was built. But just by looking at it, you wouldn't be so sure. Here's another one from also from Ireland. Now this one is absolutely built. We can tell from the support stones, the way they're organized, although it has fallen over. But the point is, just on a visual basis, it does have a lot of similarities with the North American perch boulders. Same with this one, which is also from Ireland. Again, this is probably a combination. Like there was probably something naturally here. I don't think this was built totally from scratch. Could have been, but you think they would have done a little more if they were going to all that trouble. I think it's more likely that there were just a few extra pillars put down to level off the capstone. But it's hard to say. I mean, that's the whole point. It is hard to say a lot of times. Apparently this was also used as a tomb, though, at some point. This is a pretty famous one from Wales. They call it Arthur's Stone, but you know, it does look a lot like the balanced rock in North Salem, New York, doesn't it? Here it is from a couple of other angles. Now, in this angle, you can see this other capstone, which probably has got something to do with the actual tomb. I'm not 100% sure of exactly what's happening here, but here from this angle, you can see more of the pedestals. They look a little more regular. So there's little doubt that this was put together, but just a superficial similarity with the North Salem balanced rock is impressive. It's another one from Wales, a similar thing. So this just goes to show that sometimes the pillars are not necessarily as tall and as plate-like as some of the more classic ones here. I'm not sure what this section is. It could be a natural outcrop that they've just incorporated by adding a few more uprights. And the capstone was probably put there on purpose. It looks like there's even some grooves that have been cut into it for probably decoration. So there's another angle on the same one. Pretty impressive though. I even have another angle on the same one. All right, now there's another one from Cornwall. I think I've been to this one myself. This isn't my photo, but I think I made a tour of Cornwall a few years ago and was able to take in quite a few of these. This is one from Devon. It's a little more like your classic dolmen look. Now we go to France and Brittany. Normandy and Brittany have quite a few of these scattered around, just showing one or two examples. So it's totally constructed, but it just goes to show that in this case, the capstones do show about the same amount of wear as the uprights. So you just have to, analyze the whole thing. You can't go by just the checklist and say, oh, here the capstones look like they're just as equally as eroded as the uprights, so therefore it must be manufactured or natural. But in this case, it is manufactured, so it's complicated. So this was just a couple more from Brittany. I think it's the same one twice here, different angles, similar idea. Here's one from Germany, where the uprights look like they're almost as big as the capstone. So just the point being just that the style does vary quite a bit. It's not constant. And in this case, we're not even sure if this is a megalithic tomb. It probably is. It looks like one. It looks like there's a certain amount of manipulation going on there, but I think this one is even controversial, mainly because it's controversial that there were even megalithic people even in the Azores. I mean, I think there's mounting evidence that there were, but at the moment, I think the official view, is doubtful that there were, but this might be one reason why people eventually begin to accept the idea of megalithic people in the Azores, or Neolithic people. Now, this one's certainly impressive. I'm not sure when the doorway was put through, if that's a recent addition or if it was in the original. This is from Sardinia, which is next to Italy. And the capstone is certainly huge. Shows the variety of things you can find. Now, does anyone want to venture a guess where this was from? The place you'd never suspect. This is the Jordan Valley in Israel. And so it's described as a dolmen. And it is, in fact, a Neolithic tomb. Looks a little different than the ones we're used to seeing, but it follows sort of the same morphology. It's a little variation. And this is one from Korea. So the one I showed earlier from Korea was a very classic shape, sort of like a table formation. But there's a number of different styles for the Korean dolmens. And this is called either their go table form or a chess table form. And basically the idea is that the table stone is very, very thick, almost cubic in some cases, and the pillars or the pedestals are very small, as opposed to the ones we were looking at earlier where the pillars were quite tall and thin. This is another one from Korea that, again, bears a lot of similarity to the North Salem balanced rock. But this is documented that this one did have a tomb under it. And same thing for this. So there's some styles that we know for sure were manipulated because we can actually excavate tombs from underneath them. And it's also clear from the pedestals that they were put there. So like I said earlier, in Korea, they call them goendals, and there's tons of them. I did a tour of Korea a couple of years ago, well, maybe 10 years ago, and I saw a lot of these, and they say they have over 30,000. And I didn't see all 30,000, but I did see a whole whack of them in different areas around the country. And they even have like several museums that are completely dedicated to the study and preservation of these goendals. And they're really excellent museums too, with great information and lots of artifacts that were discovered. And they have these, what are they called again? Can't think of the word all of a sudden. But yeah.
Diorama?
Diorama, that's it, diorama. And so there's these little toy people, and this is all like on a miniature scale. So you can look in there, and it's a recreation of the technology that was being used to place these huge capstones over these Neolithic graves. So it's really neat. You can see how we understand the thing was probably done, with rollers and people pulling on ropes. And here the high priest is directing things from the top of the stone. It's quite neat. And here we're showing the final step with the levers, putting the capstone in place. And in one of them, I managed to photograph this sequence of diagrams that show how these big stones are manipulated. Here it's being the pedestal stone is being levered into a hole dug in the ground to hold it upright. And then once you have two of those, a mound is built of dirt over the top, and then the capstone is dragged on rollers up to the top of the mound, and then the dirt is then removed, and you're left with this beautiful table-like structure in the end as a monument. So some of these, in Korea, they're determined that some of these table stones were simple monuments, that they did not actually have a tomb in them, but other ones did have a tomb in them. And some of the ones that had tombs in them were left with the dirt completely covering it to make a mound. So that the stones are like the inner skeleton of the tomb, and then the dirt was piled up all over on top of it. So like I said, the table type dolmen is identified in Korea as the style we're used to seeing and are classic Dolmen style. And it didn't always have a tomb, it could just be a monument. And then a slight variation on it is when the pillar stones are a little bit shorter, and you do definitely have a tomb, and the capstone can be quite a bit bigger than the pillars. And progressing that a little further, then they have what they call the go board style, which the capstone is really gigantically much bigger than the pillars. And then this starts to look a little bit more like our perched boulders from North America. You see a lot of visual similarities, but ours don't have tombs under them. At least I'm not aware of any, but in Korea, they generally do. And so then the final step in the progression is when it doesn't look like there's any pillars at all, but there may be pillars that are underground, making sort of a burial chamber, and the stone is now level with the ground itself for the capstone type of dolmen. And this is just a map that shows where they were found in Korea. You can see there's a huge concentration down around the Busan area, a few on Jeju Island. This is meant to represent Japan. So the Kyushu Island of Japan is a number, and North Korea has quite a few, and so does this part of China as well. So it's quite a concentration in Northeast Asia. All right, so I'm going to wrap up now. Just a couple of conclusions, and I'll say that truly, dolmens are man-made structures from different parts of the world, and they date to the Stone Age and sometimes the Bronze Age. The Korean ones are more of the Bronze Age examples, whereas the European ones are more of the Stone Age. Pedestalled boulders of the Americas are generally the result of natural glacial processes. However, not always, and it's quite a challenge to try to be confident that you can tell whether there's been a manipulation or not. But it is a fun exercise, and could be quite rewarding if you can build those connections. Okay, so I can stop now and leave it for questions.
Wow, that was a great presentation, Terry. It was both informative and fun.
Okay.
So just a few questions. Let's see, Peter Anik says, great description of glacial dolmen formation. However, given that rocks can fall into a glacier at different spots along its route, and thus experience different amounts of tumbling, can there be differential weathering of the shims relative to the capstone?
Well, yeah, and that's right. It could happen that way. So that's why you never can be 100% sure. But in some cases, the shims really have so little weathering and look so fragile that you tend to think they wouldn't have survived even a day in the glacier. So, you know, you have to go to the extreme case. If it's doubtful, then there's not much you can do with it.
Okay. Let's see, Dave Kutkowski asks, what is the size of that boulder in MacDonald Lake?
It's about the size of a Volkswagen, or maybe slightly smaller.
But probably weighed more?
I don't remember the weight of it. Yeah. I wouldn't want to lift it.
I don't think there are any other questions.
Well, that's good, because I'm getting hungry for supper.
Okay. Well, do you want to finish up the session?
I would just want to thank everybody involved, especially you, Walter, for, you were the man that really did the lion's share of the work in putting this together. But I know a lot of other people were involved, like Teresa and Harvey and Diane. So a big thank you to all the people behind the scenes for making this happen. I think it was a fantastic day of lectures and information. And of course, the presenters who really brought the product to us. Everyone did a great presentation. So I just thanked everybody, and I look forward to when we can do this live and in person, although if not, this is not really a bad way to do it either. So thanks to everyone, and have a great weekend to everybody.